If the power in your city went out tonight, and it didn't come back on for 2 weeks, no phone signal, no running water pump, no working stove, no streetlights, no gas station pumps, most people you know would be in genuine trouble within about 72 hours. Food spoiling in the fridge. No way to heat a home in winter or cool one in summer. No way to purify water once the bottled stuff runs out. And yet, less than 150 years ago, entire families lived through brutal winters on the open plains, with absolutely none of those modern systems. And they didn't just survive, plenty of them thrived for generations. No power grid ever existed for them to lose in the first place, because they never depended on one to begin with. So today, I'm digging deep into 15 forgotten survival tricks that pioneers, settlers, and frontier families actually used to stay alive, stay warm, stay fed, and stay sane, long before electricity was ever a thing. And here's the part that should genuinely grab your attention. Almost every single one of these tricks still works exactly as well today. During a blackout, a winter storm, a hurricane aftermath, or any situation where the modern conveniences you rely on every day suddenly disappear without warning. Stick with me through all 15. Take mental notes, maybe even write a few down. Because the last few on this list are the ones almost nobody remembers anymore. And they might be the most genuinely useful of the entire group. Let's start with trick number 1. The root cellar cooling method. Long before refrigeration existed, Old West families kept food fresh, using nothing but dirt, depth, and airflow. And the science behind it is honestly more impressive than people realize. A hole dug several feet into the ground, lined with straw, wooden shelving, or even just packed earth, stays remarkably cool and stable year-round, because soil at that depth barely fluctuates in temperature, regardless of what's happening above ground in the open air. Summer heat waves, winter freezes. None of it reaches down that far in any meaningful way. Families would store root vegetables, dairy, cured meats, and preserved goods down there, sometimes keeping food fresh for months at a stretch. If your power goes out today and your refrigerator stops working, digging even a shallow pit in a shaded part of your yard, insulating it with straw, cardboard, or old blankets, and storing your perishables down there can buy you days of extra freshness you'd otherwise lose completely within hours. Even something as simple as an insulated cooler, partially buried in the ground and covered over with soil, mimics this effect surprisingly well, and it costs you nothing but a little labor with a shovel. Trick number 2. Banking your fire overnight. Frontier families didn't have thermostats, and they definitely didn't have the luxury of waking up every 2 hours to feed a fire, but they knew exactly how to keep one alive through an entire freezing night without constant attention. The trick was called banking the fire. Near the end of the evening, once you had a solid bed of hot coals built up, you'd pile those coals into a tight, compact mound, and then cover the whole thing generously with a layer of ash. That ash acts as a natural insulating blanket, slowing the burn rate down to an absolute crawl overnight, while still keeping the coals alive underneath. Come morning, you uncover the coals. They're still glowing hot, and you can rebuild a full roaring fire from those embers in just a few minutes, instead of starting completely from scratch with flint, steel, and kindling in the freezing cold. If you're relying on a fireplace or wood stove during a blackout, especially in winter, this single trick alone can save you an enormous amount of firewood, effort, and honestly sleep, because you're not waking up every couple of hours just to keep the fire from dying out completely. Trick number 3. Rendering fat for emergency light and fuel. Before oil lamps were common on the frontier, and especially in stretches where oil supplies ran low or simply weren't available at all, settlers would render animal fat, slowly melting it down over low heat and straining out the solid impurities to create a crude but genuinely effective fuel source. That rendered fat, often called tallow, could be poured into a simple container with a cloth wick, and it would burn steadily for hours, producing real usable light in the dark. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked, and it worked reliably. In a modern blackout, if you happen to have cooking fat, lard, or even excess grease on hand, and you've run out of candles or your flashlight batteries have died, this old method is a legitimate backup option, and it actually burns cleaner and longer than most people expect once you get the ratio of fat to wick right. Trick number 4. Using snow as an emergency water source, but only the right way. This sounds obvious on the surface, but the Old West taught a very specific rule that people still get wrong today, sometimes with dangerous consequences. You never eat snow directly to hydrate yourself, because doing so actually lowers your core body temperature and forces your body to burn more energy, warming and melting it internally, then it gives you back in usable hydration. Frontier travelers crossing snowy terrain always melted snow first, over a fire or in a container held close to body heat, before ever drinking it. If you're ever stuck without running water during a winter blackout, this is a critical distinction that can genuinely mean the difference between staying safe and slipping into hypothermia in a real survival situation. Trick number 5. The wet blanket cooling trick for extreme heat. On the opposite end of the temperature spectrum, settlers surviving brutal summer heat with zero electricity used a surprisingly effective, almost embarrassingly simple trick. Soak a blanket or a heavy cloth in water, and hang it in a doorway or an open window where a breeze can pass directly through it. As the water evaporates off the fabric, it actively pulls heat out of the air moving through that space, cooling the room. It's essentially a manual, zero-electricity version of what modern swamp coolers do mechanically, with fans and water pads. During a summer blackout with no working air conditioning, this trick can meaningfully drop the temperature in a room, especially when combined with cross-ventilation, meaning open windows on opposite sides of the house that let air actually flow through rather than just sit stagnant. Trick number 6. Reading the sky instead of a weather app. Old West settlers didn't have forecasts, satellite imagery, or push notifications warning them of incoming storms, but they became remarkably accurate at predicting weather changes just by paying close attention to the natural world around them. A visible ring around the moon at night often signaled incoming precipitation within a day or two, caused by high-altitude ice crystals that tend to precede storm systems. Birds flying unusually low and roosting earlier than normal frequently meant a storm was approaching, because dropping air pressure genuinely affects how birds are able to fly and where they choose to seek shelter. Smoke from a campfire that hangs low to the ground and refuses to rise normally indicated humid, unstable air, often a reliable precursor to rain. None of these signs are perfect on their own, but stacked together, they gave frontier families a real, usable early warning system. During a blackout, when you've lost access to weather apps and forecasts entirely, relearning even a handful of these natural signals can help you plan ahead, gather supplies, or seek shelter, instead of being caught completely off guard by changing conditions. Trick number 7. Preserving meat through salt curing and smoking. Without any refrigeration at all. This was an absolute cornerstone survival skill on the frontier, arguably one of the most important skills a household could have. Meat packed generously and thoroughly in salt, or exposed to slow, low-heat smoke over an extended period of time, can last for weeks, sometimes even months, without any refrigeration whatsoever, because both salt and smoke create an environment that harmful bacteria simply cannot survive or reproduce in. Salt draws moisture out of the meat, and bacteria need that moisture to thrive, so removing it effectively starves out spoilage. Smoke adds a layer of natural preservative compounds on top of that same moisture-reducing effect. If you're facing an extended power outage and you have meat in your freezer that would otherwise spoil and go to waste within a day or two, a basic salt cure, even a rough, improvised version using whatever salt you have in your kitchen, can save far more food than most people realize is possible without a working freezer or refrigerator. Trick number 8. Multi-purpose use of everyday household items. Born entirely out of necessity rather than convenience, frontier households simply didn't have the luxury of single-use anything, because resources were scarce, and replacements were often days or weeks away by wagon. Flour sacks became clothing once emptied. Ash from the fireplace became a key ingredient in crude soap when combined with rendered fat. Vinegar served as a cleaning agent, a food preservative, and even a rough medical antiseptic for minor wounds, all from the exact same bottle. This mindset, treating every single item in your home as having multiple potential uses rather than one narrow, single purpose, is exactly the mental shift that makes modern blackout survival dramatically easier and less stressful. Before you assume you need to run out and buy specialized emergency supplies the moment the power goes out, take an honest, careful inventory of what's already sitting in your home and think through the alternate uses hiding in plain sight. Trick number 9. Natural insect and pest deterrence. Without any modern pest control sprays or products, settlers relied heavily on things like dried herbs with particularly strong scents, hung near doorways, windows, and food storage areas, along with strategically placed cedar and other naturally aromatic woods to keep insects and small pests away from stored food and living spaces. During an extended blackout, especially in warmer months when pests become significantly more active and refrigerated food storage becomes far trickier. These old natural deterrents are a legitimate, chemical-free backup option that's genuinely worth knowing and keeping in mind. Trick number 10. The straw and layered clothing method for retaining body heat without any modern insulation materials whatsoever. Old West families facing brutal multi-month winters with limited heating fuel relied heavily on clothing layering, but with a specific twist most people have completely forgotten today. Straw or dried grass, stuffed carefully between layers of clothing or blankets, creates surprisingly effective insulation because it traps countless tiny pockets of air, and it's actually that trapped still air doing the insulating work, not the straw material itself. This is the exact same principle modern down jackets and synthetic insulation rely on, just achieved with whatever was available on the frontier instead of manufactured fill. Long. If you're facing a winter blackout without working heating and you're running low on blankets, stuffing dry newspaper, straw, or even loosely bunched up fabric between your clothing layers mimics this old trick almost perfectly, and it can measurably improve your body heat retention through a long cold night. Trick number 11. Reading water sources for relative safety without any testing equipment available at all. Frontier travelers developed a real, practiced instinct for identifying safer water sources long before water testing kits or purification tablets ever existed. Moving water, like a flowing stream or river, was generally considered safer than still, stagnant water. Because movement introduces oxygen into the water and makes it considerably harder for certain harmful bacteria to establish and thrive, water located near abundant plant life and visible animal activity was often, though certainly not always, taken as a reasonably good sign compared to water sitting in a barren, lifeless area with no surrounding vegetation. To be completely clear, none of this replaces actual water purification, and boiling water for a full minute remains the single most reliable method available to anyone in a modern emergency. But these old observational skills gave settlers a genuine first line of judgment when they had absolutely nothing else, no equipment, no tests, no way to know for certain to go on. Trick number 12. Building a simple solar still for emergency water extraction from the ground itself. This is one that genuinely surprises people, because it sounds almost too clever and modern for the era. But it truly was used, especially in the drier, more arid regions the frontier trails passed directly through. Here's how it works. Dig a reasonably sized hole in the ground, place an empty container in the very center of that hole, and then cover the entire hole with a sheet of plastic or tightly woven material, weighted down firmly around the outer edges with rocks or soil, with a single small weight placed in the middle directly above the container to create a slight downward point. As the sun heats the exposed ground beneath the covering, moisture trapped in the soil evaporates upward, hits the cooler covering material, condenses into droplets, and slowly drips down into the container waiting below. It's slow and it won't produce huge quantities of water in a single day, but in a genuine emergency situation with absolutely no other water source available, it's a real functional method that requires zero modern tools or equipment to construct from scratch. Trick number 13. Signal fires and smoke communication across long distances. Long before radios, telephones, or any form of electronic communication existed, frontier communities developed surprisingly sophisticated systems using fire and smoke to communicate across distances that voice simply couldn't reach. A large, well-built fire at night was visible for miles across open country, and thick smoke produced during daylight hours, sometimes deliberately manipulated by covering and briefly uncovering the fire in specific patterns, could convey basic pre-arranged messages between distant homesteads or separated travel parties. During a modern blackout, especially in a rural area where cell towers might be down entirely, and communication with neighbors genuinely matters for safety, carefully managed signal fire remains a legitimately viable way to indicate your location or general status to others who know in advance to watch for it. Trick number 14. And this is one that gets forgotten constantly, even though it shaped modern medicine in ways most people don't realize. Herbal remedies for basic everyday ailments, using plants that were actually well understood and reliably identified at the time, never guessed at or assumed. Willow bark, for example, contains a compound very closely related to what eventually became modern aspirin, and it was widely used by frontier communities to reduce pain and bring down fevers, long before pharmacies or manufactured medicine of any kind existed out on the plains. Chamomile was commonly used to calm upset stomachs and help with restless sleep, and it's still sold in tea form for essentially the exact same purposes today. To be completely clear, this is absolutely not a suggestion to replace modern medicine or professional medical care. and misidentifying plants in the wild can be genuinely dangerous, sometimes fatally so. Meaning this only applies if you already reliably and confidently know exactly what you're identifying. But understanding that these remedies exist, and that basic plant-based relief options were a real, genuinely effective part of frontier medicine for generations, is valuable knowledge to at least be aware of if modern medical supplies ever become unavailable during a serious extended emergency. And trick number 15, save deliberately for last, because it might be the single most underrated item on this entire list. Community-based mutual aid, treated as an actual deliberate survival strategy, not just a nice sentimental idea. On the frontier, isolated families very rarely survived long-term purely through individual self-sufficiency, no matter how skilled or hardworking any one household was. Survival depended heavily on neighbors actively checking in on each other, sharing surplus food during lean stretches, pooling labor for tasks too large for a single household to handle alone, like barn raising or harvest time, and maintaining genuine social bonds specifically because everyone understood, deep down, that isolation itself was a real and serious danger, not just an inconvenience to be tolerated. During a modern blackout, this Old West instinct, actually knowing your neighbors by name, checking in on elderly or vulnerable people living nearby, sharing resources like a working generator, extra stored water, or a functioning stove, is consistently one of the single most effective survival strategies that exists anywhere, in any era. And it's also, unfortunately, the one that modern society has drifted the furthest away from. Rebuilding even a small version of that old frontier mutual aid mindset before an emergency actually happens, not scrambling to figure it out during one, might genuinely be more valuable than any single piece of survival gear you could ever buy. So there you'll have it, 15 forgotten Old West survival tricks laid out in full. And what should really stand out to you by now is that almost none of them required any money at all. None of them required specialized modern equipment, and every single one of them is still fully usable today, sitting quietly in the background of modern convenience, waiting patiently for the one situation where the power grid, the supply chain, and all our usual everyday comforts suddenly aren't there anymore. The families who crossed the frontier and built lives out on the plains weren't superhuman, and they didn't have access to anything we don't still have access to today. They just carried practical, hard-earned knowledge that modern comfort has slowly, quietly let the rest of us forget over the generations. And now, having sat through this, you're carrying a piece of that knowledge too. If this gave you a genuinely new appreciation for exactly how resourceful people used to be with almost nothing, stick around, because coming up next, I'm covering the Old West tools and hands-on techniques that modern survivalists still swear by even today, the ones that never actually went out of style at all, they just quietly went out of everyday use. I'll see you in the next one.